Hi, I'm Frank Daly, and welcome to That Sounds Interesting podcast, which features interviews, discussions, and short stories on topics which are unusual but relevant in the current world. If I asked any random person on the street, what is Stoicism? I'm pretty sure many of them would be hard-pressed to say any more than a sentence or two about it. And I have to include myself in that group. So I had to do quite a bit of research before talking to today's guest, Peter Daly, my brother, and an avid fan of Stoicism. Welcome, Peter, and thanks for being on today's podcast to talk about Stoicism, which I believe has undergone a big revival in the past decade.
Hi, Frank, and thanks for inviting me. If you asked a random person what Stoicism is, you would probably hear something along the lines of what is Stoicism with a small s. We use the word stoic in the English language to mean something like a British stiff upper lip, or perhaps something like the character Spock from Star Trek. This is really a caricature of what Stoicism meant in the ancient world. Stoicism in the ancient world was a philosophy, a major philosophy of life, in fact, and it has, as you correctly point out, undergone a major revival today. So what we're talking about here, for the sake of our listeners, is Stoicism with a capital S.
Okay, so Stoicism is a philosophy, not a religion. Is that correct?
Yes. So modern Stoicism, we would say, is compatible with a range of different metaphysical beliefs. So in that sense, it's what we call a broad church, if you like. There are people who are Christians, Buddhists, and so on, although, to be frank, the majority of modern Stoics are probably atheists or agnostics. But in the ancient world, Stoicism, or rather philosophy, to an extent, represented an analogous position to religion in the modern world. It was a way of life. It wasn't simply about philosophical theories for their own sake. One of the great leaders in Stoicism, Epictetus, chides his students for idle chatter about philosophy. And Marcus Aurelius says, talk no more about how to be a good man, just be one.
Okay, so you mentioned two Stoics from the ancient world. Who were the main Stoics in the ancient world?
Well, it was started around 300 BC by Zeno of Citium. So it was started in the Greek world, and then it spread, of course, through the Roman conquest of the Greek world into the Roman Republic and then later Empire. A lot of writings have been lost, but we do have a good deal of writings from a number of Stoics in the early Roman period. These are, in particular, Seneca, who was a prolific writer and statesman, and also for a while a tutor to Nero before he was ordered to commit suicide. And then there was Epictetus, an ex-slave who, among other philosophers, was banished from Rome and set up a school of philosophy in Nicopolis in what is present-day Turkey. His writings were recorded by a statesman, Arrian, who seems to have engaged in some form of shorthand in his classes. Epictetus didn't write anything himself, but his verbatim conversations and dialogues with his students were taken down and form what we call the discourses in 4 books. And then later we have Marcus Aurelius, who of course is probably the best known Stoic today. He's very popular in the 19th century, although he was very much out of popularity in the 20th century. He wrote a book called Meditations. They were not intended for publication. They were notes to himself, to ways of keeping a journal to remind himself of Stoic practice as he fought a war on the border against the barbarians. And in fact, he makes a character portraying Marcus makes a brief appearance in the film Gladiator, where he's seen writing in his tent.
That's very interesting, Peter. It's very interesting to get the history, the background to this philosophy. But now that we have some background on it and who the main ancient Stoics were, let's discuss the philosophy itself. What are the central ideas in Stoicism?
The central idea in Stoicism is the importance the all-encompassing importance of virtue. Now, virtue sounds somewhat stuffy and Victorian to our modern ears, but what they meant by virtue was the practice of the four cardinal virtues of the ancient world: temperance, justice, courage, and wisdom. And they see these basically as being what makes a human being an excellent human being. They point out to the excellence of a racehorse being the ability to run fast, or of a dog to hunt, or of a knife to cut. So similarly, the excellence of a human being is to be rational, because we're primarily rational beings, and they elevate the importance of rationality. And second of all, we're social beings. So within that context, unlike Aristotle, who said that virtue is the chief good, the Stoics made the somewhat shocking claim that virtue was the only good. And the other things that we call good, such as good health, wealth, fortune, etc., are what are called preferred indifference. In other words, they're to be preferred, but they're not absolutely essential for leading a virtuous and therefore a happy life, as the Stoics would see it. So virtue is central. And within this context, the idea of what's called the dichotomy of control is absolutely a central concept. It means basically, as Epictetus says in his handbook, certain things are under our control and certain things are not under our control. If we pay attention to those things which are not under our control and believe that they are, we're going to be fairly miserable. If we pin our hopes on absolutely achieving our work ambitions, our ability to be wealthy, to be successful, to be admired, respected, remembered, and so on, these things are not ultimately within our control. We may, for instance, go on a diet, we may be practicing a very healthy regime, but ultimately whether we get sick or not is entirely outside of our hands.
So if Stoics accept what things that are in their control, will they just acquiesce to dictatorships or injustices?
No, because the Stoics, Stoicism means that you do in fact have to accept what is outside your control, as in the modern day serenity prayer, which is very much based on Stoic lines, which is give me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. But Stoicism is not fatalism. It's not quietism. It's not about turning inwards and focusing only on the inward life and seeking enlightenment, as one might in the devotees of certain Eastern religions. Stoicism was very much concerned with action in the external world. Stoics expected to fight against injustice where they see it, and a number of major Stoics paid with their lives, such as Cato, who opposed Julius Caesar. And in fact, it's quite notable that although he wasn't a philosopher or a teacher, he was regarded as a major Stoic simply because he exemplified Stoicism in his daily life and in his actions.
Okay, so can we turn now to the concept which you mentioned earlier on, which is leading a good life? What's the Stoic approach to that?
Well, the Stoic approach is that we must really pay attention to what is in our control, what is not in our control, and focus on making what the Stoics call a good use of impressions. So an impression is something that might be regarded as, for instance, an external event, or it might be a thought, a disturbing thought, or it might be an occasion for anger. The Stoics have a sophisticated theory of emotions. They believe that we certainly, if we get a sudden fright, we can't help reacting in an involuntary way, but we must not give our consent to buying into the anger or buying into various other negative emotions. Effectively, Stoics are not about being passionless, about being Spock-like, which, as I mentioned earlier, is a caricature. Stoics oppose what are called the passions, by which they mean those negative forces which can, if left unchecked, can make our life a misery, such as anger, to which they pay particular attention. In the modern world, we would talk about depression, anxiety, and a range of other mental conditions which can make our life fairly miserable. On the other hand, Stoics believe in cultivating positive emotions, particularly those emotions which are associated with our roles as social beings. So we must look to what roles do we play? Are we a father, a brother, a son, a husband, a citizen? And the Stoics ultimately see a fellowship with all human beings. Hence the concept which we have today, or the word we have today, of cosmopolitan. They believe themselves to be citizens of the world, ultimately. So there's a series of expanding circles of concern. We're immediately concerned with our immediate relatives, beyond that our friends, beyond that our society, and so on.
Okay, so you've just said here that there's a social aspect to Stoicism. So, and you were giving that interaction with regard to family and with people in our influence. Is it all outward looking in that respect, or is it a combination of inward looking and outward looking?
Yes, that's probably a reasonable way of looking at it. It's a combination. I mean, one obviously exhibits courage. One could do that in a variety of ways. One could do it in battle, for instance, the most classical sort of example that they had in mind. But one could also do it, say, in bearing one's illnesses or in dealing with difficult personal circumstances. So it's a combination of both.
Okay, so can I ask now a question about the influence of Stoicism, and in particular with regard to cognitive behavioral therapy? And maybe we could start by actually defining what cognitive behavioral therapy is.
Yes, CBT is the main form of talking therapy today. It's an alternative for depression and anxiety in particular. It has a vast amount of double-blind placebo-controlled trials which show its efficacy is as good as a course of antidepressants. And sometimes it's used along with antidepressants. It really arose in the middle of the last century when the founders of it, Aaron Beck and Ellis, looked back to the works of Epictetus, where Epictetus said, it's not death or exile, which is terrible, but the fear of death or exile. So this prompted them, along with a number of other factors, to think about the importance of our thought processes and our beliefs in various mental disorders. At the time, Freudianism was quite dominant, but it was quite unscientific. So the basic concept in CBT is that we have an activating event, A, we have a consequence, C, but in between A and C is B, which is your belief about it. For instance, to give a simple example, you may be used to a friendly hello from your boss every day. You come in one particular occasion and he just grunts or ignores you, and you immediately start worrying that your report is pretty unsatisfactory. So you feel bad about that and maybe worried about your job. It's all a consequence of your belief about it. And the solution to it is to engage in D, A, B, C, D. D is disputation, where you challenge the thought, look for alternatives, and try to thereby control your emotional reactions towards it.
That's a really interesting idea, in that you're never just accepting the first thing. So people who worry a lot, for example, right, would be picking on what they think is the worst possible item and then believing that's what it is when it mightn't actually be it. And so Stoicism advises them to consider other possibilities that might have resulted in the situation.
Well, yeah, that's particularly CBT, yes. But we must appreciate that the one of the problems with people that have anxiety or worry is to worry that a very unpleasant outcome may occur. And the attitude of a lot of people, let's say amateurs, who are advising them, might be along the lines, oh, it'll never occur, you're exaggerating it. That may be appropriate in some circumstances, but the reality is that it may well occur. And therefore, this attempt to seek reassurance simply makes the situation worse. As, for instance, in the treatment of anxiety in CBT, where running away from your problem, avoiding, in agoraphobia, for instance, avoiding being outside, is precisely what fuels the problem. So the worst case scenario may well occur. And in Stoicism, the Stoics treat us not to think that something bad is not going to happen, but it may well in fact happen. But that when it does happen, you will be able to bear it because you will have the tools for dealing with it. For instance, death is an example. You may be reassured by well-meaning individuals that there's no chance of you dying. There may well be a chance of you dying. And in fact, the Stoics recognize that engaging in contemplation of death and the fact that it's a natural process is, as Epictetus says, a bogeyman, is very positive. As Epictetus also says, if it's not going to happen now, then it'll happen later. So,
okay, well, of course, I mean, obviously that is something that's going to happen at some stage in your life. We all know that. But the thing is that focusing on it exclusively at a particular time could be depressing in some ways.
Well, yeah, the therapists and, certainly CBT people would advise that this is something you would need to work up towards. You would need to be able to handle it in case. But there is a thing in CBT called exposure therapy. I mean, the most classic example might be, say, somebody's afraid of a spider. They're brought into a room with spiders, and they get progressively closer. And by the end of the therapy, they can take a tarantula walking up their arm quite easily. Yeah. So similarly in both CBT and Stoicism, there is a focus on what's called imaginal exposure, where you can imagine certain negative circumstances in order to reduce your anxiety. And it's been shown that if it's done in the correct way, you can greatly reduce your anxiety about certain feared circumstances occurring. There's a particular, to return to the question of death, there's a particularly good story told by Epictetus. This senator called Agrippinus was being tried by the Senate, but every morning he used to go for his bath, so he decided there was no reason to change his plans. When he came out, his friend said to him, "You've been condemned." He said, to death or to exile? And the answer was to exile. And then he said, "What about my property? Has it been confiscated?" And they said no. So he said, "Splendid. In that case, let's go there now and have lunch, because lunchtime has arrived." Epictetus says this shows what's possible when you keep your will in line with nature. In other words, with what's required of a Stoic. I must die. If now, I die forthwith. If not, I will take lunch now, because the time for lunch has arrived. And dying, I'll tend to later.
Okay, well, that's really very practical, I have to say, and to be trained in thinking in those lines. But in some cases, I guess people find that they are challenged by the worries that they have, and maybe Stoicism does give them some relief. That's possibly why, as we were discussing with regard to CBT, it could be beneficial.
Stoicism has influenced CBT. Stoicism is a philosophy of life for everybody, whether they have clinical, psychological or psychiatric conditions or not. So CBT is specifically short-term treatment for those psychiatric conditions. Stoicism, by contrast, is a philosophy of life for those who are well as for those who are sick.
Of course. Okay. Well, that's a good way of describing it, I guess. Can I just turn actually just a slightly different tack? Are there many groups of modern Stoics in the world?
Yes, there's a lot of Stoic groups which have got going. The Stoicism was very much out of fashion in the 20th century, but towards the end of the century, there was a revival in what's called virtue ethics, the focus on not the type of way that ethics is has been taught in recent times in philosophy, which is to focus on ethical dilemmas, but rather in terms of building character, as the ancients would have thought, building a virtuous character. And there was a number of major writers like Professor Anthony Long, who wrote a superb book on Epictetus and his role as the Roman Socrates. And then in the 21st century, a number of writers started producing popular books. First was Bill Irvine with his The Art of Stoic Joy in 2009. And then that was followed by somebody who's very prominent, a very prominent leader in the modern Stoic movement, Donald Robertson. He's originally a Scottish psychotherapist, moved to Canada and I believe is living for the moment in Athens. He wrote Teach Yourself Stoicism. And then there was also a group of people who founded the modern Stoicism project, and they have a blog where various essays are produced, and they organise an annual Stoicon. These are people like John Sellers, who's also a Stoic author, who wrote Lessons in Stoicism, and there are a number of others at Exeter University, some of whom are psychotherapists and some are involved in philosophy. So as well as the annual Stoicon, there's also been a growth of Stoic groups around the world, and there is a type of overarching organization that tries to keep them in communication with each other called the Stoic Fellowship, run by James Kostecki in the US and his colleagues. So that's a brief overview of what's happening.
So how could you put Stoicism into practice?
The Stoics have a set of practices. Like anything, you build up skill and experience by actually doing it every day, whether it's a sport or coding software, whatever it is. The Stoics start off with a brief morning meditation, thinking about the day ahead, the sort of obstacles they could face, and what sort of Stoic principles they can put into practice. One of the key Stoic ideas is in the idea of the reserve clause. And the example they give of this is the Stoic archer. Let's say a Stoic archer is out hunting, and he's aiming at a deer with a bow and arrow. He fires the arrow, but anything can happen. The deer may move, the wind may blow it off target, or his aim may be bad. So all he can guarantee is to make the effort to hit the target. He can't guarantee it. So we must undertake every action with a reserve clause, more or less saying that I will do X so and so, I will do X and Y, fate willing. In other words, if it's possible.
Yeah, in other words, I make best efforts in order to do this, and if I don't manage to do it, well, that's okay.
Yes, exactly, and it presents an opportunity then to practice another virtue, which is the art of Stoic acceptance. If you miss the target, so those are the sort of things you put into practice during the day, and at the end of the day, then you review how you've behaved as a Stoic. Did you lose your temper? Did you get over upset when you missed the target? Did you behave in various negative ways, giving way to passions or so on? And you try to work out for yourself how you could do better tomorrow. Stoics also believe in putting into practice what are called maxims. That is, having short quotations from the Stoic masters that they're able to repeat to themselves. As one of the leading French scholars, Pierre Hadot, said, what we need are short phrases which we can repeat ourselves in difficult circumstances so as to check the movements of fear, anger, or sadness.
Okay, that's excellent, Peter. And so in other words, basically they're kind of like affirmations that people sometimes say to try and calm themselves down or to help themselves stay on target within the philosophy.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. And Epictetus' work is summarized also in a thing called the Handbook, or Enchiridion. I've produced my own Enchiridion of Stoic quotations, which I can, in a small notebook, which I can open up at any stage and read.
Okay, and dealing with different circumstances, you can turn and find what the Stoics would say with regard to this circumstance, and it helps you deal with it, I guess.
Yes, precisely. And there's another Stoic practice which I think is worth mentioning, which is called the view from above. This is very much something taken from Marcus Aurelius, where he thinks about the infinite amount of time, the shortness of life, the infinite amount of time after he's dead, and the infinite amount of time before he was alive. How he envisages looking down, maybe like Zeus, on the earth below and realizing how small the Roman Empire is, and how small, in fact, the entire planet is.
Yeah, how trivial some things that seem very big at certain times in the global context or in the bigger picture, they're probably not that big.
One thing which is particularly beautiful from the point of view of the view from above is a very famous photograph from 1990, I think it was, of the Earth. It's called the pale blue dot photograph. It was the Voyager 1 or Voyager 2 spacecraft which had reached Saturn, and they decided to turn it around towards its origin and take a photograph of Earth from 6 billion miles away. So it's an almost imperceptible little pixel, which is difficult to find in the photograph. So it's an extraordinary image of the Earth in a vast blackness.
Before we finish up, can I ask you what books are there to read and learn more, or actually start practicing about Stoicism?
Well, when you're more experienced, you could actually start to read the original documents. It's probably good to read an introductory book first, but I'll start off with some of the original texts. Obviously, there's the Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. I would urge a modern version of that. I can't remember the name of the author behind it, but there's some modern translations which are very good. I would urge you to avoid the Penguin book from 1960s, where the translation, I think, is very old-fashioned and difficult to read. There are various translations of Epictetus. Surprisingly, one of the ones from the Loeb Classical Library, which I have, which is printed in Greek on one side and English on the other, is very powerful, despite the language being very slightly antiquated. It's very beautiful and powerful use of English, and certainly effectively communicates Epictetus. So normally you get the handbook and the discourses of Epictetus in one book. Seneca's produced a lot of different documents, such as the letters to a Stoic, which gives his correspondence with somebody called Lucilius. He also wrote a series of essays. So there's a book called On the Shortness of Life, which incorporates a number of his essays. And then, of course, there's the single document by Marcus Aurelius, the Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. But in terms of modern literature, there is the Art of Stoic Joy by Bill Irvine. There is Teach Yourself Stoicism by Donald Robertson. And then a book I think is probably the best single book written on modern Stoicism, which is How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, which is on the philosophy of Marcus Aurelius. It's a great book because it incorporates history of Marcus's life and all of the difficulties he faced, particularly on the frontier against barbarians, interspersed with how to be resilient, how to deal with pain, adversity of various types. So it's a really superb book. I'd also recommend Lessons in Stoicism by John Sellers, and there's also a book on Stoicism whose name escapes me, from Massimo Pigliucci, who was a biologist turned philosopher in New York, and I think he's also involved in the New York Stoics.
Okay, that's a great wealth of information, Peter, which is available. And what about meetups and Zoom meetings and organizations around Stoicism that are here in Ireland or in other places?
There used to be a Stoic group that myself and my co-founder Joe Plowman ran, called the Dublin Stoics, on Meetup, but for various reasons, various changes and circumstances, we had to let it lapse. But there are a range of Stoic groups, or Stoas as they're called from the ancient world, in various cities. There's the London Stoics, there is the New York Stoics, there's several groups of Stoics in the US, and I think many countries in Western Europe have groups of Stoics. I'm not sure about further beyond that. Of course, the Modern Stoicism website and blog, which is very good. There is StoicCon, which used to occur physically in Toronto and London and New York every year, but now occurs virtually, and you can log on to that.
Okay, that's super. That's great to know all the details that are around and how many people are actually practicing it. So, Peter, thanks very much for providing this introduction to Stoicism and the books you've mentioned and the websites and the other resources, which might be a great starting point and also for further information.
Thank you, Frank. My pleasure.
Okay, that's it for now. I'll be back soon with another guest and another podcast of That Sounds Interesting. And see you next time.